Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to yet another installment of the Dispatch Dialogues. My name is Busiso Ngadwa, editor of the Dispatch and the Saturday Dispatch. The last time we met was in July when we hosted the former Minister of Safety and Security, Mr. Charles Magula, for the launch of his book, The People's War, Reflections of an ANC Cave. Yet again, we gather here to discuss yet another important book. And this time, that's a book that's published by our dear friends, KMM Review, and that's the book titled Electoral Systems and Accountability. And I'm sure, ladies and gentlemen, you will agree with me that given our political climate in the country and how fast the fiber of our young democracy is unraveling, it is rather an appropriate topic for us to discuss tonight. And tonight's event is part of a partnership between the Daily Dispatch, the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung Foundation, KMM Review Publishers, and from KMM Review Publishers, we do have their CEO, Ms. Ipuseng Otsokwane. Welcome, Ipuseng. And also from the University of Fort Hare, we do have the Vice Chancellor, old friend, and as all of you, most of you actually would know that the Daily Dispatch and the University of Fort Hare has hosted over 100 dialogues over the past 9 years. And but tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I will not be facilitating tonight's program. I know over the past year, you've had the misfortune of having to listen to a newspaper editor waffle on one topic or another. But I can assure you that tonight it won't happen. And for the first time, I'll get to enjoy this dialogue and be part of the crowd. And I'm looking forward to that. Because of the highbrow debate that we have tonight, we thought to bring you the best of the best. And not only do we have one political scientist, but we have two. Some of you will know the familiar face of Professor Mcebisi Ndletyana, who is from the University of Johannesburg, and is also a political analyst and a newspaper columnist. And Prof. Ndletyana will be our facilitator for tonight. And from the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung Foundation, we do have Ms. Nompumemlelo Runji, who is also a political scientist and also the primary researcher and author of the book we're discussing tonight. And ladies and gentlemen, our panel also has a man who needs no introduction. Many of you may probably remember him as a businessman and also as a freedom fighter, but most recently you remember him from Save South Africa. He does wear many hats, but tonight he is here in his capacity as the chair of the advisory council of the Council for the Advancement of South African Constitution, that is Cascac, that is Mr. Sipho Pityana. That is our panel for tonight, ladies and gentlemen. And at this point, before I get to the last point, I must say though, as you know that on the 12th of September, we marked 40 years of the passing of the great freedom fighter and leader of the Black Consciousness Movement, Mr. Steve Biko. And most of you would know the role of the Daily Dispatch, and particularly its former editor, Donald Woods, in highlighting some of the atrocities of apartheid and how, also the role he played in actually exposing the ills of apartheid. We do have in this crowd his son, Dylan Woods, who is also the chair of the Donald Woods Foundation. Welcome, Dylan. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, let me hand over to our facilitator, Professor Ndletyana, to continue with tonight's program. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Boo. When I got the invitation to come here, I couldn't miss the opportunity because this is my favorite city. Second to P, of course, my hometown. So I'm always delighted whenever I get an opportunity to come here. We're here, of course, to discuss a book, but we will not, well, to mark the launch of a book, but we will not conduct this as a tutorial. Because some of you have not read the book, and the idea is to have an interesting discussion that what's your appetite so that you get to buy the book. But we'll conduct the discussion in a way that also touches on relevant contemporary issues, using the information to guide us as a guide really to understand what is happening around us instead of sticking to that information. So that's pretty much the idea of this discussion and the format. And this discussion, I must say, it's happening at the right time. At the right time because we are faced with serious challenges that relate to the efficiency of our institutions and the conduct of public leaders. When the founders of the Democratic Republic, when the drafters of the Constitution came together, they drafted at the time what they thought was the best Constitution, dictated by the prevailing circumstances of the time. And at times they did not just have context in mind, but drafted constitutions and institutions in a way that suited certain personalities. You might have heard a discussion that has been going on for a while, which was started by retired Chief Justice, Deputy Chief Justice Ndletyana, saying that we need to review the powers that are conferred on the presidency, because these are extraordinary powers that assumed at the time of the writing of the Constitution that whoever followed would be a Mandela-like character. They did not foresee that you would, at some point, have a president as the center or source of controversy. And now we are having to review those powers. And of course, our electoral institution, electoral system as well was designed to deal with specific challenges that the new republic was facing. The idea to promote a non-racial democratic society, but with time, new needs have since emerged. People have developed different tendencies that we thought they would never have. And now we are back to answering whether or not this electoral system is appropriate for where we are. But at times we also need to pause and ask ourselves whether what we are envisaging doing is necessarily the best solution to our current challenges. Because all set of circumstances or set of solutions are not entirely best, or rather you might think that you have a bad situation now, only to find out that what you are offering as a panacea, it's not a panacea, but it then brings on a whole set of problems. What this book does in a very interesting way as well is to offer examples of what has happened in other countries, how the systems that we are proposing today have fared in other countries. And we need to ask, therefore, whether those are the kind of system we really need to adopt, given the kind of problems that they have presented in those countries. I think the idea is to accept that we have launched a process of interrogation, that there's no need to feel compelled to be clever and think that you're offering original solutions when in fact these things have been tested elsewhere. But a review must happen nonetheless. There must be a moment of beginning of sorts, introspection. And then societies do evolve because challenges do arise and some of them unforeseen. So that's the purpose of this discussion. And I will pose questions to our two panelists, not necessarily confining them to the book, but also seeking to encourage them to draw from their own general knowledge, especially to shed light on what has been happening in the Republic here and today. So the discussion will be divided or structured rather in the following way, in that we will have a 20 minutes or so presentation from each, answering a question that I will pose to each of them. And after that presentation, I will have a brief discussion of about 10 or so minutes. And thereafter, before you get bored, you will then be drawn in to pose your own questions. I often experience this audience as a very engaging and vigorous audience. I don't expect anything different tonight. We'll start with the lady, Mcebisi. I'm sure you won't mind. The question to you, Bumi, I hope it won't be a curveball because we've discussed this earlier. and I want us to just to think of accountability, voters holding their elected leaders accountable, but at the same time, how functional are these institutions? Think of accountability in the context of functionality. Do they do what they're meant to do? Because that too is part of accountability, responding to the needs of the people, doing what they promised to do. And the question really is, in the discussions that we've been having in the last 10 years or so about our electoral system, is that we need to consider having a mixed system. Proportional representation and accountability, if not that, or rather a majoritarian system. And if not that, go straight to a majoritarian system where you have a majority party or what is called first past the post party that gets 50 or 51%, forms government. And yet we do have that mixed system at a local government level. And yet today we're having all sorts of problems happening at a local government level where you have metros, where you have ham councils. There is no party that won a majority. Instead, you have coalitions. So the question then becomes, if we are really calling for this mixed system, is what is happening now a validation of what we are yearning for, or should we rethink what we think is a solution? That's the question. It's clear. All right. You want to talk from there or up here? Okay, cool. All right.
Good evening to all of you, and thank you so much for coming. And it's such a wonderful thing for me to be able to come back here. I think I was here maybe 2 or 3 years ago at a similar event, and it was very, very, very good. So I'm excited to be here as well. Thank you so much, Sipho, for your great welcome and your kind words. And to my other colleagues on the panel, Sipho Pityana, thank you very much. It's very good to share a panel on the table again with you. We were together some other time in some other place. And thank you so much, Ndletyana. I think you've asked a very pertinent question. Because a lot of the time when we discuss this debate around electoral reform, we forget that in this country we have a dual system. At the national level and at provincial level, we have the proportional representation system at play, but we do already have a mixed member proportional system at the local level. And I think that this is the right question to ask. If we're calling, and if you look at the history of the debate, the conclusion or the consensus seems to be around this mixed system. We need a mixed system to operate also at the national and provincial level, just as it does at the local level. But the question is, how has that system been working at the local level? Has it given to us that which we think it will give to us at the national and provincial level? And obviously the question is around accountability. And we cannot speak about accountability in this country without talking about responsiveness, because people are actually calling for responsiveness. We have a system wherein the Constitution places the people at the center. In fact, our Constitution goes a long way to talk about participation, to talk about consultation at all levels of government. But the question is, although those legal rational principles are there, how are they functioning, and are they effective actually? And if you look at what we've been seeing in terms of the debate between the invented spaces versus the invited spaces, we see a lot more people on the street in this country. We've become the protest capital of the world. And it basically tells us that there's something ineffective about our participatory platforms and spaces. Those consultative platforms that the Constitution provides for aren't working optimally. So people are inventing spaces. People are finding different ways to make their voices heard. And it speaks directly then to this question of the responsiveness of our leaders, the responsiveness of councillors, the responsiveness of our representatives, the responsiveness of politicians, and over and above that, their answerability, to the people, the accountability to the people. Now, the reason why we went for a proportional representation system was because it promotes certain values that are important in a society, a divided society such as ours. The question of fairness, inclusivity, representation, proportionality is important in a society where for the longest of times there's been that injustice of one group of people being preeminent over other groups. So that's why we chose the system, to foster this unity. And that said, we did that at the expense of another important value, accountability. And it's also important to underscore, before I continue, that there's no such thing as the best electoral system. Every electoral system has its virtues and has its vices, and every society has to make the decision based on its own context. I would even go further to say that, democracy is what we make of it. There's no one size fits all. You cannot import the way the system works in another country, the US, for instance, the UK, and transpose it onto another society. It doesn't work like that. So it's really a creative process of making it what we want it to be. So we are trying to strike a balance, therefore, between values. And that's why many people, many experts agree and conclude, and there's a consensus around the mixed member proportional system, because it brings the best of both worlds. You've got accountability on the one hand, because voters can vote for their own ward councillors, for instance, if we use our local system. And then they can also have a proportional representation vote as well. So you've got the best of both worlds. You've got the representation and you've got the accountability. But it hasn't been working. The truth is, it hasn't been working. It hasn't been working because the very same ward councillors and ward committees are failing to be responsive to the very communities that have put them there in the first place. Local government is very important. The reason why we had the mixed member proportional system at the local government level is that the conclusion or the assumption was that local government is at the coalface. This is where most citizens encounter the state. And this is where citizens experience government. So isn't this the place or the area where we would want them to have greater control over what municipalities do, over what their leaders do, over what councillors do? And therefore, as opposed to having a proportional representation system as we have at the national level, we went for this mixed member proportional system. But the reality is the same councillors, the same ward committees are not responsive to communities. Hence, you find communities burning down houses of councillors, hunting down councillors, because a lot of them aren't even available, they're not even there where the people need to engage with them in the first place. So that's the one failure that we see. The other thing that is very interesting to note is that the logic of the mixed member proportional representation system at the local level actually clashes with the logic of how our political parties actually function. Councillors actually do not have the autonomy that we think, or that communities think they do have. Because on the one hand, the people during elections will elect a specific individual to be councillor, to represent their ward, and they expect a certain level of an ability to make decisions and take decisions on local issues that affect the people of that area. But the reality is that that councillor does not get the mandate from the community. He receives his mandate from the provincial leadership of his political party or from the national level. Now, if we use, for instance, the ANC as an example, where it prides itself about having the branches, right, that are based in the communities. Obviously, the branches will have input, particularly if we look at the policy conference, they'll have an input into the policy debate and the policy discussions, but ultimately the decision is taken at the national level. And they will have to then implement and adopt whatever decision was made at the conference, whatever decision is deliberated upon at the provincial and the national level. So the level of autonomy that the councillors and the ward committees is actually, that they actually have, is actually limited or tempered by the logic of the functioning of political parties. I just use the ANC as an example. The ANC is not the only centralized political party that we have in this country. And we just often focus a lot on the ANC because it is the governing party. So the mandates, the policies are decided outside the locality. And therefore, the argument for why don't we adopt a mixed member proportional system at the national and provincial level then has merit, in the sense that perhaps it will help to temper this limitation, because communities will not only have control over electing perhaps their ward councillors, but may have some level of control over what their representative in parliament should and should not do. But in the context of political parties that exercise very strong party discipline and punish members for going against the party line, we will continue to see that clash even in a mixed member proportional system. And I think to a large extent, that is where the ineffectiveness then of our institution lies. I don't want to get into too much, I don't want to get out of the topic too much. There are many other issues. We're dealing with state capture, we're dealing with patronage politics, we're dealing with neo-patrimonialism, and those kinds of issues that permeate our state. But if we look at the reason why even the mixed member proposal is ineffective at the local level, or the institutions at the local, the municipalities, and their ability to deliver on services and their ability to make quick decisions about development issues in localities, it has to do with that clashing of the logic between how our political party system works versus how the electoral system envisions that responsiveness and accountability should happen in our localities. I want to go to the points now about the topic of this discussion, which is how does the electoral system actually empower voters? Because it's very easy often to think as voters or citizens that we are powerless, that we are pawns of the system, that we are controlled by the logic of how the system works. And I want to show that the voters actually have become more and more creative. We as voters have become more and more creative. We are learning how to use the system to our advantage. And that example we see in the 2016 local government elections, the 27 hung municipalities. Now, how that was, we also saw the same in the 2014 general election, where voters began to split their votes between the province and the national. We saw many more voters voting for a specific party at the national level and then voting for a different party at the provincial level. Voters are becoming more and more strategic about showing political parties that they have the power to decide. And so they're able to use the system to get the kinds of outcomes or to keep political parties on their toes, so to speak. So it was a shock for the ANC when they saw the drop of support, for instance, or rather the split votes that were happening. And even in the 2016 local government elections, what we saw was again that voters have learned to split their votes. So they'll vote for a specific party when it comes to the ward seat, and then they'll vote for another party when it comes to the proportional seat. Now, what that does is that it creates this coalition politics that we are seeing. And it basically means that no party is guaranteed a victory. And it pushes us towards what the German system actually now has, or actually what has become characteristic of the German system, is that no political party in Germany, for instance, is guaranteed a majority. So they have learned to forge partnership. They have learned to forge consensus as political parties, because they know one party knows that it cannot get into a government without other parties. And the unfortunate thing that we are seeing with these hand councils is that our political parties are not yet, how can I say it? They have not yet learned the art of negotiating and consensus. And that's why we are seeing the problems that we are seeing in municipalities, particularly the bigger ones that we are really paying attention to, the city of Joburg, the city of Tshwane, Nelson Mandela Bay, because they have not learned that when the electorate has made this kind of decision, what the electorate is basically asking for is for parties to begin to work together, to begin to negotiate around policy issues, around issues that have to do with the well-being and the improvement of the lives of the voter, the lives of the citizens, as opposed to just politicking. And I think that is the value, therefore, of a mixed member proportional representation system, in the sense that it does allow voters the space to be creative. It does allow voters the space to show political parties that nothing is guaranteed. And in a way, it has brought us to the point where we have greater competition in our political system, something that has been lacking for a large part of our political history, where it's just been predictable. We know exactly what's going to happen in the election. The voters turned around and surprised us in 2016. So I think for me, the takeaway also, when you get into the publication, the takeaway is that citizens actually have power. They actually have agency. Because if you read the book, you'll find various systems used in various countries. They all have different outcomes. None of them has the same outcome, as that it all depends on the kind of society and the history of the society, what has happened to inform the decisions that people take, the political system, etc. But ultimately, voters become creative. They don't allow themselves to be prisoners of a system. It takes time. It doesn't happen immediately. It doesn't happen overnight, but it does eventually happen. And I think for us, if we continue to agitate as citizens in this country, continue to agitate for accountability, agitate for responsiveness, but not just from the comfort of our homes and on Twitter and whatever, but actually get onto the streets in the invited spaces, which is the participatory mechanisms that have been provided in the Constitution, but also in the invented spaces like this. This is an invented space where we come together to discuss and debate these issues. Ultimately, we'll begin to realize that we actually have the power to decide what we make of the system. And ultimately, it will be up to us to show our leaders and show political parties that they can't just do what they want to do, for instance. And I think for me that's the value of debates like this, and also that's the value of sort of watching how our system has evolved. In terms of how do we then improve the effectiveness of institutions if our system never changes? And the book does speak to this point, that changing the electoral system is not the only thing that we need to do. Mcebisi alluded to, what Justice Ndletyana said about the powers of the president. We also have to do a lot more around regulating our political parties and internal party democracy in this country. Part of that includes party funding, the regulation of party funding, etc. But also we need to do a lot more voter education, where we raise awareness around the power of the electorate, the options that the electorate actually has. The second part about voter education that's very important is that when we look at the protests that we are seeing, there's a huge conflation between the various responsibilities and the mandates of the different levels of government. So you'll find that a lot of the issues that municipalities become faced with and challenged with actually are not within their purview. Issues like housing, for instance, which are not a municipal function. So we need to do a lot more education so that when we demand accountability, we know where to demand it and how to demand it, because that's something that's also missing in the current debate. So I think this is very important. It opens, the book is very important, that it opens our minds to a lot of other things that we need to look at in terms of reforming not only the electoral system, but actually reforming our political system, so that we can get out of it as the electorate, to get out of it as citizens what we think is important, and also get our leaders to begin to act in the way that we need them to act. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Boom. The long-awaited day finally dawned yesterday, and Pietermaritzburg. And the judgment was very brief. Didn't last more than 2 minutes. And it was obviously over the ANC constitution. The whole controversy boiled down to the meaning of the ANC constitution. I've come to realize over the years that every ANC member believes that he's an expert on the ANC constitution. And each thinks they know better than the next person. I had a long discussion a while ago with Ndletyana over a very interesting drink in one of the hangout spots in PE. And obviously the discussion was about his standing for chairperson of the REC and the Nelson Mandela Bay. He believed that he was in the right, and he took out his cell phone, showing me the constitution and saying, "Hey, Mkulu, awuyazi le way wena kanje." And he was paging me rule 4.1, and you're laughing at me and saying to his face, "Mkulu akayazi le way ufunda incwadi." And he believed that he knew the ANC constitution. And hardly 3 days later, he realized that he doesn't quite understand the ANC constitution. And then this brings me to my point, which I want Sipho to reflect on, as well as reflect broadly on this topic. Whether changing the electoral system will necessarily work. Do political parties, our party system, our parties function in a manner that will give meaning to that electoral system? We talk of accountability, we talk of efficiency, we talk of members following their own conscience, we talk of prioritizing people's interests first. These are all part of accountability. But our parties themselves configured in a way that enable the realization of accountability. Knowing what we know, Seda, about our parties, we will really get this accountability. Please come to the podium.
Good evening, everybody. You know, when I come to this part of the world, I feel that it's my moment of crucifixion, because I get asked to say difficult things. And here it goes. Thank you very much, Sue and Professor Buhlungu and everybody here present. It does give me a special feeling to have Dylan here, Donald Boot's son, it being 40th anniversary of Steve Biko's passing, and the great work that his father did to expose the brutality of the apartheid system. Welcome, Dylan. You know, my good old professor at university, in some place of exile where I was a very aggressive professor and used to assert his positions very strongly and quite intimidatingly. So one would be inclined to not disagree with him and just say, you know, Prof, you've hit the nail on the head. Great minds think alike. And I got disabused of that notion, because he would quickly stand up and say, careful, careful, son. Fools never differ. You know, accountability is the lifeblood of democracy. First of all, I want to make this point that, and I think I'm not going to review the book, but it says something very important, that a democracy is a social contract, an agreement, a deal between citizens. What it doesn't say, and it should say very strongly, as much as it is a social contract, it is also a social construct, because that deal is informed and shaped by the aspirations and what people desire, and it is constantly changed and reconfigured as we go along. The second thing I would like to say is that we need to remember that public representatives are servants of the nation. They are servants of citizens. They carry public trust and honor, and they must value it. Hence, they are referred to as honorable. I know that many of them, when they leave Parliament, they don't want to drop the title, even though they no longer enjoy that trust. Their integrity and public duty, a sense of public duty, is assumed. Their commitment to people above all else is assumed. They are respected by citizens, and citizens expect them to respect in turn. They enjoy trust and confidence of citizens. So accountability fails when that trust is breached. And with the breach of that trust, you see the erosion of legitimacy of democracy. You see unlawful conduct sometimes on the part of citizens, respect for government, disrespect for government, and consequent instability. And these manifest because citizens often feel that they don't have options and mechanisms to express themselves, to be heard, to influence, and to be taken seriously, or to call those that they have put in power to account in a particular way. One of the key and critical aspects that is touched on in this research is the essence of transparency and its importance in the survival of democracy, because it enhances public trust. So the president's son, who's very young, very handsome, is a billionaire at a very young age. So transparency works like this. Mr. President, can you please explain how this young man's billionaire status coincides with your assuming the presidency of the country? It's not an unreasonable question to ask, is it? And you are expected to answer that question convincingly, because the peers, the age group of your son, who are more educated than your son, sometimes more experienced than your son, are among the long queues of the unemployed, the destitute, and the desperate. So you have to explain, as part of this process, enable these who feel that they are destitute and desperate, that they might follow your son's example, because you may have gotten there unaided. That's accountability, isn't it? So your MPs, MECs, and premiers whose families suddenly get jobs in the public sector and are successful in business and are successful in other places, in corporates, they become senior leaders. People ask, how did it happen? After all, this fellow was a guard at school. I was much brighter. It's legitimate for society to ask, and they deserve convincing answers to this. That's what transparency is about. Mr. President, we know that your family loved you very much. They are not particularly rich. In your workings, there is no way you would have had 250 million rand to buy a property in Uganda or anywhere else. So when they ask this question, they deserve fair and reasonable answers. That's what transparency is about. I mean, local government leaders, mayors, and municipal representatives have to answer the same question. Why do schools cost 3 times to build when in fact it is possible to build 3 schools with the price of 1? Why do you have an RDP house paid for by the state, reflected on the budget and accounts of the state, but in fact the house does not exist? Why do you have clinics where money has been spent for medication to find its place on the shelves of the dispensary of a clinic, but in fact it is not there? That's what transparency is about. You citizens are owed convincing explanations and answers to those kinds of questions. So transparency is not a nefarious, nebulous type concept. It is at the heart of the functioning of democracy to enable citizens to have confidence in their leadership. Democracy doesn't work unless citizens are able to reprimand leaders that are not able to provide convincing answers. When the president is not able to say why his son is so rich, citizens ought to be able to call him to step down and be able to do so. When these answers are not provided and sanctions is not meted out, we have a society where there is impunity. So this is how we construct our democracy, as a corrupt system, because we are tolerant to that corruption. We all aspire for public office so that we can enrich ourselves and not as a public duty. That's how we construct our democratic project. So that's what I mean when I say democracy is as much a social contract as it is a social construct. Bumi makes a very important point. She says we have power in the Constitution as citizens, more power than we imagine. And that's because the Constitution affords us to shape and construct it. That's why we're a council for the advancement of the Constitution. You will note that we're not a council for the protection of the Constitution, which needs to be protected sometimes. But it is not the end of the story. South African citizens must know that from the time that pen was dropped, when that Constitution was signed, they have to think and think again as to whether it serves them and change it when it needs to. So citizens who are not able to play this role are disempowered because they're not able to take on those who have betrayed their trust. So where does the electoral system fit in? And so we shout. I read the other day a statement by former President Mbeki, and he tries to go into this. And he's somebody that I respect. And his analysis is an analysis that I disagree with all due respect.
Respectfully.
And so we all marched, and we do so today, and we say, Amandla, Amandla, all power. And so we must coin a phrase, because in fact our constitution has delivered for us a new phrase. Amandla, a political party. All power to a political party. I would assert that the PR system has failed South Africa's democracy in many respects. If there was any doubt about that, the latest no confidence vote is a very interesting example of that. A president who, based on the finding of no less a body than the Constitutional Court in March 2016 or thereabout, breached his oath of office, his promise to us as a nation. I'm not accusing him. A court has made this finding, that this president has lied to the nation, continues to hold office. One of the key features in our struggle for liberation was the fight against colonialism, because colonialism was a system that took our right to govern ourselves. We were fighting for a right to self-determination, to decide our own future. The public protector in his state of capture report essentially impugns that the power of the executive has been usurped by crooks. So a president and an executive who have been elected by us has no power. That power is exercised by a bunch of crooks. They appoint ministers, bureaucrats, state corporations, boards, and executives, and through them, they direct the affairs of the nation. We have no relationship with them. We don't know who they are. Many of us have never met them. We can't call them to any meeting and call them to account. And this, our president has done for financial gain. And so the public protector's preliminary findings are substantiated in the Gupta leaks, which show the connection, that here is an email that says, you and you will be appointed here and there. This is what we expect of you to do. Who won that tender, etc., etc. These immigrants from India, not South African citizens, they were not part of our struggle, are now dictating the affairs of our nation. So that our hard-won right to self-determination, the essence of our freedom, the very essence of our freedom, is handed over to a criminal gang of international networks and groups. Now, listen to this. On this basis, a broad societal formations, including ANC stalwarts and veterans, COSATU, SACP, every trade union federation you will ask for is aligned. Faith groups, business, civil society, call on the president to step down on that basis, that the trust has been betrayed. And this, if anything else, short of a referendum, is a proxy for a nation that says, you as our public representatives have failed us. And they urge our public representatives to support a motion of no confidence against the president. Because they have no way of calling, citizens have no way of calling the president to step down directly. After all, he's been put there by his political party. So if the broad civil society formation that we've seen in the recent period, is an indication of where the mindset of the nation is, then the voice of the nation was completely ignored if the outcome of the vote of no confidence is anything to go by. The painful message that comes from that, every time I look at myself in the mirror, I ask myself, is this a party that I'm part of? Is that condemnation of our nation to a bunch of crooks and thugs and looters is what this country deserves, says the ANC. It must be wrong. So, citizens of this nation, it must be concluded as a result of that, were betrayed. They were disempowered from sanctioning those MPs because their masters are not the people, but the party. And they toed a party line. Let's wait and see what the verdict of us, the masses, will be in 2019. Interestingly, in the contestation that is happening now for presidential contest within the ANC, all of the contestants were members of the National Executive Committee of the ANC. All of them. They were there when this state capture was being constructed. All of them were there. It must be so that the nation deserves an answer from them as to what it is that they each did to stop it. It cannot be good enough for them to just commit that will deliver clean government, etc., etc. There was a moment when their principled leadership was necessary. We don't know what they did. They owe us an answer. If only they could tell us so that we can trust them to be our presidents in the future. Tell us what they did. How did they stand up to challenge that? I know that there's an emerging strong culture against proportional representation. And by the way, it's not the first time that the ANC had an occasion to choose, to make a choice, and they chose MPs, chose the party instead of choosing for the nation. In 2009, by the way, President Zuma was not the only candidate for president. And when I saw that, I said to myself, you know, if I was in that parliament, I would have voted for the other candidate. The competition was between President Zuma and Reverend Ndletyana, a graduate from Cambridge. And President Zuma is a graduate at Standard 4 from Ghana. I mean, what a brilliant choice. The rest is history. It doesn't matter which political party they came from. If the ANC put forward a candidate who had all the hallmarks of inadequacy, whose integrity was in question at the time, those members of parliament owed it to us as citizens to not vote for that person and vote for somebody who has an integrity at least. Not everything about PR system is negative, by the way. Today we have a strong opposition party formation, which has held government to account. We may not agree with their politics, we may not agree with where they come from. There are certain issues around which, regardless of which political party you come from, you must agree with some of the issues that they raise. We would not be where we are with many of the revelations around corruption in this country, were it not for the fearless and fearful engagement by the opposition parties. So the PR system has enabled us to produce that opposition. And the culture of opposition in this country and multipartyism is as strong as it is. To conclude, addressing this question is that we must be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. The PR system has its advantages, and so do other systems have their own advantages. For instance, ask yourself a question. If we had a presidential election in 2014, would you have voted for President Zuma to be the president of this country? Given the disastrous first term that he delivered, would you have the premier that we have in this province and the mayors that we've had in this city? Certainly, it does raise the question about what kind of political electoral system we should have. I don't necessarily agree with some of the points that have been made about the ward PR system combination and manifestation at local government. By the way, one of the things that I marvel about local government is the fact that parties forced a candidate, a ward council candidate, and often people put forward an independent and beat that candidate. At least that opportunity is one of those that we need at a national level, perhaps. Coalition governments are prone to being unstable everywhere else in the world. But you know what? They often are saying something. It's a mandate from society that we know we differ, but we expect you to find common ground. Help us find common ground on certain issues, to unite us and to create conditions for a social cohesion. So I dare say that the journey towards finding an electoral system that works for South Africa will include elements of a PR system that has not worked in many respects for us today, and possibilities of presidential system and election of certain officers in certain positions, etc., etc. I think that we place a great deal of importance in institutions. One of the critical things about South Africa's experience is that we've been harmed by single party dominance in this country. It has not served us. It has created a hegemony in politics that has brought with it disregard, disrespect, and contempt for ordinary citizens. Because you only respond to citizens as an elected public official if you think that they have a potential and a possibility to get you out of office when their time comes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sipho. You've raised quite a number of interesting issues from a different perspective, and which serves to I suppose, trigger a whole lot of questions in our minds. One of the things, especially linked to what I said earlier on, that an electoral system functions within a broader political system. In the rare moment of clarity, President Zuma had very interesting comments to say on the Zimbabwean elections. It was one of those many elections where ZANU-PF had simply refused, or the commission there had simply refused to announce the elections. And Jacob Zuma said, it's only in Zimbabwe where you have a president sitting on the election results for 29 days. Which I thought was quite refreshing of Jason to say this. You know, one would have hoped that he's not sober-minded most of the time. Which reinforces, because in Zimbabwe you do have a constituency-based system. It's meant to enforce accountability. But the ZANU-PF functions in a very malfeasant manner. The monies are siphoned from state coffers, which brings then into question the efficiency of the entire system. How about the electoral system? Because, or rather, the electoral commission, which is the body that determines how many people go to parliament or how do they go to parliament, ensures that the process is fair and everything else. In this country now, with the ANC teetering around 54%, we have all sorts of problems around the party, and with elections down the corner in about 2 years or so. Do we have a reason to worry that our electoral commission might go the same way? Can you reflect on that? You are amongst friends, so you can speak freely. In any order, sorry.
Well, there's a dictatorship of the women of this, and well, our electoral commission is a very important thing in our democratic system. I certainly am very proud of the way they've conducted themselves in the past period. Very proud again of the opposition parties, and we join them when they raised concerns about the conduct of the previous chair of that commission in having business dealings with a member of parliament who belonged to a different political party, which showed an inclination to be biased. It does suggest that political party is an important institution. The truth of the matter is that Chapter 9 institutions are elected by Parliament. And Parliament is dominated by a single political party. And it is always important for citizens to be on guard. In the case, it has not changed the way IEC has conducted itself with integrity. But it does not good enough reason for us to be complacent, given the fact that we today have a president with the condonation of the ANC that has undermined Chapter 9 institutions, appointed poodles in many of them, and made them, where they were effective in the past, to be ineffective. Worry about the proposed changes to the IT systems at the IEC, because our electoral system is IT driven. And for the first time, when we have a prospect of an election in 2019 that is going to be the most fiercely contested, it's not time to actually fiddle with those systems. Worry about every other change that happens in that institution, because it is at the heart of ensuring the integrity of our democratic system. So it is not beyond manipulation. And I would suggest that active and vigilant citizens should not be reckless about throwing allegations against it, because its integrity and protection of its role is important to all of us, but we should not hesitate to raise alarms when it is necessary to do so.
Thank you.
I'll just add, the independence of the IEC is not guaranteed. We do, and we've had a history of an IEC that has been committed to running elections in a transparent manner. But this has also happened in the context of political parties and a governing party that has been willing to play by the rules. The difficulty, and if we look at recent elections, for instance, in Kenya, is that, number one, if the integrity of the IEC is in question, the willingness of those who participate in elections to actually regard whatever result comes out and is announced by the IEC as free and fair diminishes. Secondly, where we have a situation where the political parties that are competing and contesting are not willing to play by the rules, even if the IEC is independent, its independent functioning will be hindered. So to the extent that there will be a propensity, particularly within the ANC or within the governing party, to hold on to power at all costs, we should fear for the independence of the IEC. To the extent that we saw, I think in 2014, the EFF raise alarm about certain things that were done with certain ballot boxes in certain areas. And it didn't go as far as launching an actual appeal, or complaint about it. But there is potential for such things to happen. The question then we need to ask ourselves is, will that be by virtue of a lack of independence of the IEC, or because of machinations by the governing party, which is obviously fearing to lose power? And so those dynamics, it will be an interplay between those dynamics that determines whether or not the IEC will continue to perform at the levels that it has performed previously. Also, to hasten to say that, experience has shown that there's no such thing as a perfect election. Something always goes wrong somewhere. But then there's a margin of acceptability of an election. So there'll never be such a thing as a perfect election. Our elections have not been perfect. We have been lauded the world over for how the IEC has run our elections, but it's not to say that it's been without glitch. So in the same way, we may find ourselves in the position that other countries, our sister countries, have found themselves in if we don't manage these dynamics. And also then to underscore then the importance of civil society, the importance of citizens, the importance of us being vigilant and making sure that political parties and the IEC itself knows that ultimately it is the people that are in power here, the people that they have to answer to ultimately. And I think that's what we have to continuously underscore as South Africans.
Isn't that being a little bit alarmist, though, to have this inevitable, there's a sense of inevitability about the corruptness of the IEC? If you look at recent rulings, for instance, the Electoral Court over the voters' roll in Cascac, and the ANC was taken to court by independents in a small remote town of Potchefstroom. And the Electoral Court, they went to the court repeatedly. They even included the Constitutional Court, and they made a massive ruling, very important ruling, that every voter must be on the voters' roll, and their address must be reflected properly. And so there is a sense in this country, wherever there's been a suspicion of electoral impropriety, it's taken up by the court, and the courts rule fairly, and most of the time siding against the ruling party as well as the IEC. So when are we not again being overly alarmist when we have this sense of inevitability that things will go wrong, when evidence so far points to a system that seems to be able to protect itself?
I think perhaps I was misunderstood. I'm not speaking about the inevitability. It's not inevitable. If we look at the IEC's past conduct, as I was saying, it has functioned in an independent manner, in a transparent manner. But what I'm talking to is that we shouldn't be complacent. There's a sense that we get in this country where our institutions perform so well that we begin to become complacent about what can and cannot happen. There is a possibility, should like I said, should political parties not toe the line. Yes, we have courts, of course, that can intervene in such situations. But it is, the courts, to the extent that they can deliberate over legal issues and legal matters, the courts cannot stop the flow of politics. and the dynamics, the political dynamics of any country. They can only go as far as they can go. But it's not in any way to say that that is inevitable. Obviously, we have seen, like you mentioned, the courts intervening and the IEC, and actually this is it's actually a good example of the fact that we shouldn't be complacent. If the IEC was found by the courts to have breached their own regulations around how to maintain the voters' roll, that means we should always be vigilant to know that something else could go wrong as well. And that could have a material influence on the outcome of an election. So we have to always be vigilant. It's not to say that our IEC is out to do nefarious things, but it is always good to keep people on their toes. But not only the IEC, because the IEC can only function independently and effectively in the context of political parties and political players who are willing to play by the rules, who are willing to conduct themselves according to the prescripts of the conduct of the code of conduct that is prescribed for elections. And once we get to a place where that is also under suspicion, that is where then we have to even be more vigilant. So in the context of 2019, where we know that it will be competitive because of where the ANC finds itself sitting, we have to be all the more vigilant. Also for the sake of the IEC, not to disparage the IEC, but as citizens to help safeguard the integrity and the transparency of the IEC.
All right, Sid.
I think it's important to say, I mean, I agree with you that we shouldn't be alarmist, but when you have a situation in 2016 after the setback that the ANC suffered in local government elections, and you have IEC commissioners summoned to Luthuli House, is a cause to be alarmed. When they are asked about people that they deploy as electoral officers, we used to use teachers, why are you using other people? It's a cause to be alarmed. It does signal a turn of events along the lines that Mpumi is talking about, that we need to be vigilant, shouldn't be paranoid, we shouldn't cast aspersion on a very important institution without any basis and founded facts. But we have to be vigilant because 2019 is going to be a fiercely contested election. If the IEC fails us, it could plunge this country into a dark place. And you only need to see what has happened in other countries. Suddenly, the IEC is such an important institution. Its integrity has to be beyond reproach, unlike any other election. If that's being alarmist, I'm quite happy to settle for that.
I see. The Indian example in the book points us to a very interesting scenario, which is somewhat similar to what we have here. The Indians have a constituency-based system where candidates stand for elections and are elected by voters directly. And yet, in the campaign, the parties are fond of using party symbols instead of the names and faces of the individual. Because apparently most of the electorate are illiterate. So to avoid, to get around the problem of not being able to read, it's a lot easier to identify with the party, which then means that the party remains the dominant factor, attraction to them voting instead of the individual. Here in South Africa, here in our own country, we have by-elections. I mean, we had an interesting by-election at Tinaha. You will forgive me, so I won't use the example as Ndletyana. There was an interesting by-election. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. He was expelled by the ANC, I think it was in 2014, 15, somewhere there. And he stood he stood as an independent to challenge ANC candidates. And the party brought in heavyweights, Cyril and everyone else, and promised all sorts of things. And part of the reason why the national machinery continues to be deployed in local campaigns in a by-election is because the branches are not functional. They don't have a program to campaign. They virtually do nothing. Then you need to call the whole deputy president from Cape Town to campaign the Kailicha over. So my point there, I'm sure we can think of other examples, but I want your reflection on this. If we insist on constituency-based elections, we have candidates elected directly. Presumably, these will be candidates that are well known to the voters locally, but they don't have sufficient machinery of their own. They say they don't have money to launch effective campaigns. Then how do you stop the party being in control of such campaigns and ultimately determining what eventually happens? I'm trying to explore the issue of the autonomy of the candidate and the party discipline. You see this contrast, right? Right? And you are trying to assert your autonomy, having been elected, let's assume, having been elected directly by the electorate. I want us to home in to this issue of party systems and electoral systems. Do these parties at a local level function in a way that enable accountability? Can they go solo, a party caterer, mount an effective campaign completely on their own to a point where they're able to say, I want it all on my own means, and therefore I'm autonomous? Are we there yet? Can we just reflect on that?
One of the important lessons we learned from such a comparative study is that the majoritarian systems do not overcome in and of themselves the dominance of the political parties, as you've underscored. And that's why I was saying that when we look at reforming our political system, we can't just stop at the electoral system. It's only one element, it's only one aspect. And one of the things that we need to begin to consider is the logic of the functioning of our political parties in this country. If we take the example of the US, the party machinery is important, extremely important. But candidates also have a certain degree of autonomy and power because in and of themselves, because of who they are, because of what they can do in terms of the lobbies that they have, they bring something on the table as well. So there's a balance between what the candidate, or rather the autonomy of the candidate, and also the influence of the party over the candidate. That's one of the reasons, for instance, an outsider like Donald Trump could come in and steal the Republican ticket.
But he had money.
Yes, that's the point I'm trying to make, that there's a personal influence in the candidate that he brings onto the table. The challenge that we then find in the context, for instance, the Indian context that you raised, is that the candidate may be a candidate on their own, but they rely heavily on the party machinery. So that autonomy, again, is a problem. Also, if you look at the German system, before they separated and had two votes, they had a mixed member proportional system, but they assumed that if a person voted for a party, I mean for a candidate, they were also voting for that candidate's party. And that was before, I think, the 1953 election, if I'm not mistaken, where they had decided then to split the vote. where there was 2 votes as we have it in our local government elections. And the logic, the assumption there was that the candidate is from the ANC. So obviously, if a voter votes for candidate from the ANC, they also support the ANC. And they had to change that thinking. So the political party will always remain central. That's what we find. Until and unless there is some leverage that a candidate brings onto the table that makes the political party value the candidate as well, and the input and the influence of the candidate. Whether they're bringing money, whether they're bringing a specific lobby group, etc. But then again, we come to the challenge of money in politics. You know, what value do we want to promote in our political system, for instance? So for me, the answer lies around the very functioning of our political parties and what they emphasize in their own constitutions, the values that they espouse. Are people the center of those political parties? The people on the ground. To what extent do they engage and involve people's views and participation, communities' views and participation as they go about doing their own business? In the context of South Africa, we can't deny the fact that our politics is heavily influenced by the fact that we are an unequal society. Inequality is a big problem. And so politics is seen as a route to material gain and the distribution of resources. And therefore, we see the existence of what that report on state capture done by the group at PARI speaks about, the shadow state versus the constitutional state, right? The bureaucratic state versus exactly. So we have a situation where on the one hand, we've got these mechanisms, these constitutional mechanisms that are provided for people to be heard, for people to be accounted to, etc. But on the other hand, we have a system where the leaders, the councillors, representatives use their state position for private ends. And they have this patron-client relationship. Because unfortunately, people are lacking their need. They have material needs. So becoming a councillor, being on the ward committee has a material gain. And so there's this ladder of distribution of resources. And this is not only existing in the state, by the way. Civil society has also been co-opted. The private sector also relies on the same relationships, the tender system, for instance. So our system, our electoral system functions in that context, which makes accountability difficult because people will not bite the hand that feeds them. Let's put it that way. It's difficult to bite the hand that feeds you. So we need to also begin to address.
So I'm saying people don't eat principles.
Yeah, well, yeah. I'm not saying I condone it, but I'm just trying to highlight the reality of our situation. So if we talk about electoral reform as a panacea, we are missing many points. So we need to begin to address the developmental challenges. We need to begin to address the issues of inequality in our society, because our political system exists in this context. It doesn't exist outside this context. And our electoral system functions in this context as well. So if we are going to be able to have the kind of accountability that we want to see, and be able to make sure that the candidates or the councillors, etc., are beholden to the people rather than to the political parties and the party bosses and the people who are giving them, tenders and whatever. We need to go beyond just electoral reform. I think electoral reform is very important. We need to have the constituency element in our electoral system, but we need to go even beyond that and begin to talk about forging solidarity in our society, right? That goes beyond just the politics of accountability, and talks about how do we achieve substantive democracy. And if we look at some of the people involved in the Save SA, you know, Mark Haywood and the work that he does, and many of those civil society organizations, that's what they're working towards, is realizing that substantive democracy that makes people beyond just pawns because of their poverty, because of the inequality in our society, but they realize that they have agency and power. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
Well, I think the point is well made that electoral reform is not a silver bullet. You're not going to sort out these issues just by effecting electoral reform. We have constitutional frameworks that basically are about ensuring and promoting accountable government, and that public representatives should be accountable. There are a whole range of reasons why they are not operating optimally and they're not delivering that result. And we need to be quite careful not to attribute all of the shortcomings around a lack of accountable democratic governance to just a limited electoral system. I also need to warn that you know, the publication is quite inclined towards a majoritarianist approach, if you like, as if the masses are always right. But there's a tension in our society because to be a constitutional democracy is to be a values-based democracy. We've made choices as a nation that this is our value system. So you can do all kinds of things that you want, but within the framework of these values. For instance, we're a society that is committed to equality. We're all equal as citizens. And yet we're a conservative society. For instance, if you went out there and had a referendum on same-sex marriages, I can tell you before that the outcome of that referendum is announced, that it would meet with public disapproval. And yet it betrays the principle of equality that we have agreed to in the Constitution. If you ask South Africans whether they support death penalty or not, they would support death penalty. And yet it betrays the principle of a right to life in our Bill of Rights, etc., etc. So we've made choices that this is who we are as a nation. We're not a majoritarianist society. By the way, I had the occasion there to, you had a chat with me, I had a chat with my leader, Gwede Mantashe, who was accusing us of being anti-majoritarian. And I said to him that ANC has never been a majoritarianist organization. It's always taken positions of principles, convinced that it can persuade society to come around to those positions. So a system that we formulate must not be populist, because the majority sometimes can be wrong. And if we just follow the loudest, we'll live with disastrous consequences. We are where we are because of a populist president. He doesn't think the Constitution matters. He doesn't bother to understand it. So as far as it's concerned, if the majority says that goes. It doesn't matter what the law says and the Constitution says. So there's a problem with that, because you need to be able to lead and move society in a particular direction. You also need to hear what society's expectations and aspirations are. The democratization of political parties is a civic duty of citizens who become members of that political party. You can't demand a democratic dispensation in an electoral system that says one thing in broader society and settle for less in your political party. It just doesn't make sense. Oh, by the way, this is the culture that's happening now in most political parties because of politics of patronage. You are prepared to settle for less because if you don't, you're going to miss out on being a candidate for a next position. So you think it's wrong, but you will shut up.
A truly transformative leadership that enables us to be the best that we can be. I suppose that's what you're saying, indeed. Just before we open it up for questions on this issue of eating Bumi, I had yet another discussion in PE somewhere. And I was telling this fellow he was involved in a campaign, and you know, was telling me what they are going to do and this and that. Then I'm not talking. Guys are liars. And he say, when I'm in Nyanya, on that note, let's open it up for questions, folks. You've had a lot of food for thought. I'm sure you have naked questions of yourselves. Can I see some hands? There's a hand over there, the white page. There's a second hand here. Is there a third hand? Third hand and a fourth hand. Let's go in that order, please. First hand.
First, let me thank the panelists for this important event that brought it to us. It is thought-provoking. It is an opener. It simply tells that the people, the so-called constitutionalists, should come and get some studies from you, gentlemen. I can simply tell that the political conception of democracy is relative.
Not tonight. Please, yes.
Okay. No, I'm saying it because okay, let me start with the last question. The last question is, let us pretend hypothetically that I'm a president, or I want to stand as the president of this country in 1919. And I come with the ideas, the opportunistic ideas, like protectionism, narrow nationalism, and so on and so on. In view of the fact that our people do no longer pay allegiance to the parties and do not have confidence in parties, they would like to vote for a person who would think they will do better for them. Would I be elected as a president according to you? As you can see, this question, that's the question. It's been delivered by me.
Prof. Ndletyana from Patan. I'm very thankful, of course, to be given this platform. We have quite raised a number of issues here, but my interest here is on the issue of electoral reform. We have spoken here about mixed system versus proportional representation. And I want to agree, of course, with the speakers that no system, you see, is the best, because both of them have got flaws you see, proportional representation was conceived, of course, to address the issue of inclusivity, fairness, blah, blah, blah. And then if you come to the mixed system, especially at local government, I want to agree, of course, with Mr. Pityana. The question here is that where does the power, you see, lie? You see, in this situation, you see, does the power lie? That is with the people. That is not with the political parties. And in this situation, that is the way. That is the question.
There's a third hand, the gentleman over there.
Firstly, allow me to appreciate what has been an excellent presentation to now. And I'm sure the daily discuss quotes, which we'll hear in the paper tomorrow. I wanted to put onto the table a few other issues which haven't been raised here, which particularly relate to democracy at work. The first one we heard about the IEC, but we don't have the IEC doing its job without the Municipal Demarcation Board, first of all, defining ward and municipal boundaries. And I think we should put on the table the question of gerrymandering of these boundaries, both at the municipal level and within there at the ward boundary level. The second issue I'd put onto the table is one which hasn't been mentioned. I couldn't see it quickly in the book, just flipping through it. And that is the issue of a preferential voting system, such as is used in Australia. We hear about the winner take all and the other sorts of systems, but I haven't seen reference to the preferential voting system. By the way, the point of raising these is to ask the two panelists to comment on these issues. The third one is the issue of public participation, which of course appears in the legislation, the municipal legislation. But in my experience, it's mostly a box-ticking exercise and for a box-ticking purpose. For example, if we want to consult the people about their views on matters which should go into the IDP, Integrated Development Plan, why do we ask them for their views at the end of the process instead of at the beginning of the process?
That's the last question, right?
No.
Well, excuse me, pardon, we're limiting the input so that we can allow everyone to speak.
I'm making some points.
No, but we can't speak forever. I mean, we have to have a limit.
I would have finished by now if you hadn't interrupted. We have a large majority party. We need to look at the government strategy, why it wants to retain that. Why do they keep people ignorant with a poor education system? Why do they keep them dependent on the government through SASSA grants and with the threat that they'll lose their grants if they vote for another party?
Okay, let's have someone else. We
need in this country to have political education. So
let's have someone else.
The difference between citizen.
Let's have someone else. You started quite well. Now you're spoiling it. You started extremely well. I don't know why you think that you shouldn't be limited to questions like everyone else. If you are to participate in a public discussion, you have to abide by the rules and be civil with that. Can you have the next question?
Because elam kamandi ngokuyithi ngalisuphi omukuthi ke mncinci nje lokana siyanida ukubana ngaba siyanida ukubana siziqhekeze inhloko kangaka about ezi systems. Is it worthy for us to go this far length to just get to these systems? Is there no other alternative? Do we even need to vote? So we know that there could be an alternative that we can create for ourselves, because I believe the best system that works is a family system. And
family system?
It's a family system, nothing beyond that.
Okay. We'll have the questions answered before we move to the next row. I'm not sure what the gentleman meant by family system. He was saying we should crack our heads. And then he's introducing an idea to crack our heads. And for me.
Okay, let me just deal with
you might even combine all the questions. You don't have question 1, question 2,
yeah.
then you can take it right.
Okay, I'll just make a brief comment and try to touch on the points that were made. Well, obviously, in terms of a candidate coming out of the blue and wanting to be elected on the basis of some radical issues like was asked back there, we don't have a direct voting system or presidential voting system in this country. So it would be impossible. You know, our president and the MPs, you know, it's decided in the political party, there's a list system. The book explains it extensively. So no, it wouldn't be possible. Just to briefly answer that question. The second question about where does the power actually lie is very important. For me, I think the issue we're dealing with is not just a matter of elections. It's about how do we give voice and power to the people beyond and between elections. I think that's one of the challenges that we face in a democracy such as ours. Because every 5 years, people get the chance, they go there. The legal, rational aspects of our democracy are not a myth. They actually happen. People go, cast their ballots, their votes. The elements of the participation where they can go and attend in visas and meetings and IDP meetings, etc. That's not a myth. That happens. The question is, how effective is that voice? Are they heard? Or like somebody said, it's the tick box exercise. And that's where the problem then lies. Is that it's not that people don't speak, it's not that the people don't speak, it's that they are not heard. Or when they are heard, the system or the institutions or the leadership is not responsive to what the people are demanding. And those are some of the issues that we need to begin to speak about, is how do we make those platforms actually effective? How do we make the people's voice effective? How do we make them not just seen but heard? You know, there's that saying that, you know, about children are supposed to be seen but not heard. To a certain extent, that's how our politicians treat voters in this country. Voters are to be seen but not heard, right? And so those are the dynamics for me that I think are even more pertinent. And this question of electoral reform must begin also to address that question. So where does the power lie? At the moment, the power lies with the political parties and the political party bosses. That's just the reality, particularly between elections. Voters are only useful and necessary when it's time to vote. That's the only time voters and the electorate and the citizens are useful. And this doesn't just go for the ANC, it goes for all our political parties. And so it's something that we need to begin to think about. And again, I'm going to keep harping on about this issue of agency. It is us, the people, who must begin to demand that accountability. We can't sit back and, you know, say, okay, it's fine, and be complacent. And I'm not saying that South Africans are doing that. And I think that when we see local communities, when we see civil society organizations, not only swelling the streets, but swelling those imbizos and demanding that what they say be put into the documents, etc. We need to see a lot more of that happening. The question of gerrymandering is particularly important. Yes, and we don't talk about it enough, I think, in South Africa. We don't think it's a problem, we don't see it as a problem. But when you look at what has happened in places like Bowani and Kutsong, you know, we've forgotten about Kutsong. It's not only a matter of just, you know, the demarcation of those places, but what it actually means for service delivery, what it actually means for access to specific resources and specific opportunities, what it actually means for those that win those areas as well. You know, how does it influence the power dynamics in the country? You know, the number of municipalities, how does that have an impact on development? How does that have an impact on services, etc.? Do we need bigger ones? Do we need smaller ones? We don't really have those debates in this country. We just see things happening and we see the flare-ups, but we don't actually get into the nitty-gritties. And I think as civil society, we need to begin to be more interested about those issues. The preferential voting system, the book, yes, does cover it very, very briefly. I suppose, in my view, the reason why it's not a system that is usually spoken about is because it seems to be complex. You know, it seems to be less straightforward than the other system, like particularly the first past the post and the proportional, simple proportional representation. And I think I take your points about political education. I think I agree. I made the same point as well. But just lastly, as I close off my response to these questions, I think there is a lot of room for creativity. We're focusing a lot on mixed member versus first past the post versus PR. For instance, I may be wrong, but I think in India, one of the innovations they made is that at the local levels, political parties don't feature. It's independence. Why do they do that? Because they feel that local government is too important for it to be a matter of politics, a matter of patronage, etc. Right? So we make it just independents run. Political parties only run at the provincial level and they run at the national level, for instance. Also in India, the issue I was talking about, how voters have learned how to keep political parties on their toes. At the state level, they have a regional vote and they also have a national vote as well. Right? And they've learned how to split and play political parties against each other using that mechanism. Another thing that I think Sipho touched on it is the issue of presidential elections, direct elections for the president. So perhaps if we decide not to change our PR system, perhaps we can consider something like that as well. So there are many ways. In fact, the systems that we considered in this book are just a handful of what is actually going on in the world. There are many innovations that many societies, many countries have come up with to try and solve some of the problems that we have. And we can be more creative than what we are being currently. We don't have to be limited by what we have on the table, or by what we heard the Financial Slabber Commission say, or what this book says. There's a lot we can think about and do that would fit our context.
Including family rule?
Yeah, I didn't quite understand family rule.
I think it's an important question. It's important that we deal with these issues because they are at the heart of the credibility of our democratic project. To the extent that citizens feel completely disempowered, they have no influence on what happens and where it matters, the credibility of our democratic project will be undermined. And when that happens, the stability of our country will be compromised. So we have to explore possibilities of enhancing opportunities for ordinary citizens to feel that they have the power that the Constitution promises them. And secondly, the drafters of the Constitution were aware that this is a very critical part of the Constitution. In fact, the electoral system that we adopted was an interim arrangement. It was supposed to be reviewed and considered through a revised Act of Parliament subsequently, hence the Financial Slabber Commission, which was supposed to look at various options and give people an opportunity to do that. And it was also decided to be proceeded with in that way because of the sensitivity of getting citizens to buy into an electoral system that we decide on. So it is unfinished business as far as the architects of the Constitution are concerned. So we have to find a way to deal with that. I just want to come back to your point. You didn't introduce yourself. What's the gentleman?
I don't think he wants to be known.
Okay, so you raised the point about why we are so committed to social development, social grants, etc., etc. Now, the posture of our constitution actually is heavily biased in favor of the poor. This society expresses social solidarity with the weak and vulnerable. That's why social and economic rights are so central in the constitution of our country. Unlike many societies, they are justiciable rights. They rank the same as others. So that's a signal that says that we have a responsibility as a society to enable those that can't help themselves to make means to survive and live in dignity. Poverty is the biggest assault on human dignity. Yes, there is no state that can ever pretend that it will always be able to sustain a system of social grant. That's why we're not a welfare state system. But we have to mitigate the poor and poverty-stricken circumstances of ordinary citizens of this nation. The day we fail to do that is the day we will really fundamentally betray the aspirations of our people. It's very easy for us who are comfortable, who are guaranteed a loaf of bread at the end of the day, to forget that. Liberation has been delivered in many ways by sacrifices, among others, of poor people who took from nothing. We have no business to betray them. So when we have that discussion, I think we must take that into account all the time. But the answer is in finding sustainable economic solutions that enable people to take out a living for themselves.
Yes.
When we can't do that, we must carry that responsibility to take care of the poor.
We'll take final round of questions in the remaining 10-15 minutes. There's a hand at the back there. Right at the back. You'll be number one, just to diversify the audience. Right at the back there, number one. Any hand this side? There's no hand. Okay, we'll go back there. Is the lady only clear up? Mcebisi. Yes, 1, 2, 3. Well, 4, yes. 5, 6. And let's be brief because we have about 10 or so minutes. We don't want to exceed our time allocation. All right. Starting from the back.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you very much about the food for thought. I'm Sibulele, the surname is Ngandweni. I have one question. We are running in two parallel lanes, the civil society and the political parties. Then who is supposed to call the other to be on the same page? Because we're running in parallel in two different lanes, the political parties and the civil society. And now we are demanded that we must take them head on in terms of accountability. Then how can we do that as civil society? because we are in two different leagues. Thanks.
That was a pleasant surprise because when you started off by saying thanks, Chair, I thought you were going to go on forever. When people start saying thanks, Chair, hey. Second hand, Mama. Mwazlo.
I'm Mahlamini. Mine is a comment and just one question. First, the comment. This is very informative and it's enlightening. I wonder if you perhaps could do this in high schools and university students as well, this lecture, and perhaps to the community at large. And the second question, do you have this book interpreted into our other African languages? Because if our people could, read this and be informed, as you have done for this. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Prof, and greetings to the panel and the audience at large. I'm Toby from Tanzania. There's a growing trend from the verdict yesterday of KZN. It's something that happened in Mangaung in 2012, and it's looming here in the Eastern Cape. The dispatch spoke about this in OR Tambo region, and it might affect even the conference this month end. But now my question is, do these factional battles have a direct impact on the issues of accountability by these deployees of the party who is divided in factions? And do they have a direct influence on issues of service delivery? If so, then the poor Gogo Dlamini in the rural outskirts of the Eastern Cape, who's not here now, who's not in the delegates that go to those conferences, how can they be able to demand accountability and have their say in having their constitutional right and service delivery given to them? All right,
our constitution is enjoyed by few against so many, whites against the black, which I don't think that's what we envisaged. Now, what type of constitution, what type of democracy do we envisage so that our people can enjoy better democracy or equal democracy?
Yeah, okay. Was the fourth question that side or this side?
I have a question for Sipho Pityana. As Sibona, there's a debacle about ANC within Nakagati. My question is, if Kenzeka Dlamini wins the conference, are you going to encourage people to vote for ANC or to go for other political parties?
I don't think that question is appropriate. Go down to Monday and say, yes, sir.
My name is Tando from Cape Town. My question is simple. We speak about systems, which is very good, and it is important. But what I don't find in the discourse is, have we defined what type of citizenry that we are envisaging in South Africa? And if we have that type, what is it? And how do we galvanize society to be a type of a citizenry that will make South Africa a better place, because I want to assume that systems are produced by citizens. So you can change systems, but if the citizenry, we have not defined what kind of citizenry we have, we'll write other books about systems and systems.
Good question, thanks.
Thank you. My name is Mcebisi.
Still not participating on the full speech.
I know. And he's a public panelist. And it is exactly this Cooper in this catch-22 situation that we are in. For example, our democratic system emerged into different racial and ethnic population groups in South Africa, which are very unequal in size and unequal in income distribution, which makes Africans are the main victims of that, and it built the solidarity to the ANC. And now it's making them very difficult to make ANC to be accountable. So how are we going to get rid of that? And secondly, it's a
okay.
Yeah, and secondly, it's a PR system that we are using, which is giving extraordinary power to the neck, and which built the faction within the systems of the ANC itself. And those factions, they are disturbing the democratic systems, the viability of it within the country. And how are we going to get rid of that?
The factions, it's related to the question earlier, somebody. Okay, last question. Okay, no, last question. Please summarize it.
Hi, my name is Ade. I have a question from earlier on, from Mr. Pityana. He spoke of an electoral system that is IT based. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've all seen what happened in America between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. If the West could not control their own systems, how are we expected to control our own systems? I mean, let's be realistic. We are facing issues of state capture, yet we want an electoral system that is IT based. If the West could not control their own systems, because we all know it takes a couple of punches and systems can change all over the world. Now, do we have a backup plan that is going to solve these problems? Because the last thing we need is a situation whereby we end up in situations whereby we like the rest of our African counterpart countries. And that can easily happen because of systems. We put our faith in systems, yet the system itself fails us. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay,
Can I have the answer? I can't. But I had my hand earlier.
Okay, well, okay.
Thanks. Quick one. Am I right in assuming that if we're to take this forward, this would require, let's say this is a project, we need to change the electoral system. We would require, am I right in assuming that we would require changes to our constitution? And maybe directed to Sipho, have you actively engaged or lobbied the political parties? And if so, what has been what have been the stumbling blocks in starting talking about that? Thanks.
All right.
Yeah, I think let me start with that last question. I would like to as I indicated earlier on, the Constitution makes accommodation for a new electoral act, which it will be based on defining what is an appropriate electoral system. So I can't imagine that it would envisage it would result in a need to change the Constitution. unless the proposals therein trump certain provisions of the Constitution, which they can't. In which case you would have to change those provisions of the Constitution before you can introduce that legislation. My reading of this book, none of the systems canvassed there would necessitate that. So, Onke's point, I'm not proposing an IT-based electoral system. I'm saying that our electoral system currently is IT-based. Elsewhere, by the way, I raise a concern about the proximity of our president to the forces and the forces of state capture to the Russians, who manipulated the electoral processes in the US, if we're to believe the allegations that are out there. And I raised the question, and only raised the question, is the desire of the Russians to have the right leadership in power in this country so desperate that they would be prepared to do likewise in this country? Remember that having President Zuma or somebody in his image would enable the nuclear deal to see the light of day. Yes. So there is a vested interest here. Tando raised a question about whether we have defined the kind of citizen that we want.
For the system that we are thinking
for
about.
For the system that we envisage. You know, one of the debates that I have, and it's not a public debate, it's a debate that I have occasionally. When we passed a law against smoking in this country, in the interest of public health, President Mbeki, who many of you would know, smokes a pipe. Stopped smoking a pipe in public. Kada Asmal, who was a chain smoker, stopped smoking in public because it sends a signal, right? Our constitution enjoins us to promote public health, quality health for ordinary citizens. But our system also promotes gender equality, which means you can't be the president of the country and practice polygamy. Because inherently a polygamous system is an inequitable system. Somebody is subordinate. Same as polyandrous system, by the way. If my wife had many husbands, I would not be pleased about that. And many polygamists would not be pleased about that kind of arrangement. So it's an unequal system inherently. So when you project that system to society and say it's my Zulu culture or my Xhosa culture, all of that, you are refusing to use to leave the values of the Constitution. You are insisting on leaving the values of your ethnic base, which undermines a project for social cohesion. So when you read the Constitution, it actually speaks to what kind of citizen we should be. What kind of citizen? There are certain values around the Constitution that are about respecting other people, equality, accepting our differences, whether it's on grounds of sexual orientation or race or gender or whatever. So when somebody is violent against women, is actually betraying the values of our Constitution. So the point that was raised earlier on about public education, about our Constitution and this electoral system, that's what shapes the kind of citizen that we should be talking about, who we want to be. So I do think that, therefore, implied in the Constitution, I'm saying, is a message that conveys what kind of value system, what kind of citizens we should be. Well, I must tell you, my view is that with regard to all these people that are standing for elections for leadership of the ANC, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. I have a strong sense of a feeling of betrayal that they stayed quiet, occupying leadership roles in the ANC when all of this was happening. I find it hard to believe that they will act with the urgency necessary to reverse the tide of state capture. So I live with a resentment that these leaders failed us. Why are they not able today to clean up the state-owned enterprises, which continue to be beholden to forces of state capture? Why are they not able to liberate the criminal justice system, which President Zuma has undermined, appointing an idiot like Mcebisi to run the Hawks? It doesn't have to say much for you to know that he's unsuited to the role. Crime intelligence leaders were never about crime intelligence, but to protect the president. You can go across the criminal justice institutions. Now that we know that this is the case, why are these leaders not insisting that those criminal justice institutions' integrity is restored and are enabled to chase these criminals that have been exposed through the Gupta leads and other reports that are out there? So, whether I will vote in 2019 for the ANC or not will depend on what happens with regard to these matters. I will not vote for thieves and looters again, never. If I were to do it, I would be complicit in selling out my country. It would be the biggest betrayal. And I don't think that any citizen in this country has a right to do that. So, the factional battles that are happening in the ANC are affecting service delivery, without a doubt. You know, the fact of the matter is that if you ran a company and you had somebody who has a track record of having messed up somewhere, you wouldn't appoint that person as the chief finance officer of your company. Isn't it? Yes. How does the ANC sit comfortably and sleep well at night? Yes. With Malusi Giga as the Minister of Finance. Yes. We're now complaining about state-owned corporations that are corrupt, that are people that are corrupt, that are appointed as on the boards and as executives in those institutions, and they've been running corruption. That, by the way, has stolen thousands of jobs in this country. And they've externalized those jobs. They're now in India, in China, and in other places, and we sit with high levels of unemployment here. Now he's sitting as a Minister of Finance, trying to fix, he says, those institutions. And one of the proposals he makes is that he's going to rate the pensions of state employees that sit with the PIC and bail out the SAA and bail out a number of other dysfunctional institutions that are sitting in a mess that he created. Yes, he was there. So clearly, this is an insult. This is an insult to the citizens of this country. So, and I can go to what's happening in water affairs. Wait until you read the Auditor General's report with regard to what's going on in water affairs, what's going on in a number of other government departments. The focus today, everybody knows, you're not going to get any decisions from government because the focus is on the December elective conference. It's unacceptable. I'll leave Mpumi, who is so eloquent in dealing with this question. I was saying to Mpumi, by the way, I want to be on panel with her all the time because she tends to deal with questions more than I do. And all that I have to say is that I agree with you.
Okay, so thank you so much for those responses, and thank you for the kind compliments. You know, I think because this is a wrap up, I will try and answer the questions in this comment. Democracy, when you break it down, the word from its Greek origins is power of the people, or power to the people, right? And Sipho alluded to the fact in his opening address about when we say amand, right? We say awethu. This is an important fact. It should not just be a chant that we say unthinkingly. The power does reside with the people. We give these leaders and representatives the authority that they have. They hold it in trust. And we can take it away if we want to, as the people. And I think that's an important point to underscore. And that's why the question of political education is so important. Civic education, political education is extremely important. Part of the reason why we have some of the challenges we have in our society is because people do not understand the power that the Constitution actually gives them as citizens. So, like Sipho was saying, the Constitution already outlines the kind of citizens we need to create the society that we want. It does not need to be invented somewhere else. When we put this document together as a nation, we had already had that in mind, and we put those values in the Constitution to begin with. So it's not something that we have to reinvent. It's there, it exists. But what we need to do is empower people with the knowledge and understanding that they have this power and they can use it. They have the agency. It's there. And so it goes to the point again about, it's an earlier point I made about being seen and not heard. When it comes to the functioning of our political parties, and let me say the dysfunctioning of our political parties, we have to again look at ourselves as the citizenry. Because those political parties are made up of members who are part of this society, who hold the same constitution as all other citizens in this society. So the responsibility is ours. We cannot shirk that responsibility. Our democracy will not work the way we want it to work if we leave it to others. If we leave it to the leaders, if we leave it to the political parties, etc. We have to do the work. So if it means swelling the ranks of the political parties as members, we need to begin to do that. If it means starting other political parties, perhaps we need to do that. So we need to be committed to the project, this ongoing project. It's not going to be done for us. We have to do this project ourselves. There was a point made about, how it is that, many, or rather, South Africa was liberated by the ANC, and so people find it difficult to stand against the ANC and hold it accountable. Is that notion of the liberation dividend? Unfortunately, the liberation dividend is wearing thin. It worked for many, many years, but if you look at our electorate, if you look at how people are beginning to vote, if you look at the things that are happening in our politics, the ANC no longer has that influence or that hold on the electorate. People are starting to see that it's about their well-being, and they need to look for leaders and political parties that are interested in their well-being. So it's no longer such an obvious thing. And I think people are moving away from that. The ANC has to come around to seeing that. And also going to the point about the IT systems, I just want to make a point around electoral commissions. We have a situation in Kenya where the Electoral Commission has become such a key focus of elections, right? That the will of the people tends to get disregarded to a certain extent. So it's no longer about the fact that people are able to cast their ballots. It's about how perfect was the process, how perfect were the IT systems, etc. Right? And we need not get caught up in that. The reason why we use IT system in election is for data processing. The data is too much. We can't in this day and age be sitting and doing it and calculating using our calculators. It just would take too long. And so that's why we rely on technology. But the technology itself is not what determines the result. Yes, the technology can be, tampered with, yes, that is agreed. But the result is determined by people actually putting the cross on the ballot and whatever it is, whatever the process is in a specific country. And we need to begin to, we need not lose focus on that. Because what is happening now is that now elections are becoming about the electoral system or the management of the system, and the focus is moving away from what the people themselves have decided. And of course, we are grateful that there are courts that can arbitrate over these issues. So in a nutshell, I mean, my closing comments, and I've been hopping on about it this entire evening, is that we need not get to a point where we despair as citizens, as if we are controlled by the system, like one of the comments that were made. We're not controlled by the system. We can decide the logic of our own system. We have the agency to decide those things. And part of our work in the organization that I'm representing, the Friedrich-Ebert-Stifung South Africa, that we're very passionate about is empowering citizens to understand that agency, to understand that power. And that's why we support gatherings such as this, for instance. So that we can engage on this thing. We don't have the answers, by the way. Somebody said, but we've not heard the answers. We don't have the answers. The answers lie there with you and with the rest of society, and we deliberate together. So I think this is a great, not a beginning, because this conversation has been happening. I think it's good that we continue to have this conversation. And perhaps as we have the conversation, we'll begin to move in the same direction. Just to go to the point about we're moving on parallel paths, who must hold who to order, the civil society or political parties. Again, the point is we must hold political parties to account as the citizens. We must also hold civil society, by the way, organized civil society to account. We can't let organized civil society do everything for us. And when I say organized civil society, I'm talking about these organizations who do advocacy work, who do the lobbying while we are at work, doing the things that we need to do. They are also not free agents. They have their biases, and we need to be aware of that. So ultimately, we are the custodians of our democracy as the people of this country, because it's power to the people. Thank you.
A wonderful discussion, but I think what will be coming in front to say a word of thanks is that the dispatch custom. Well, my point short is that at times it's very easy to feel hopeless, to be despondent, and so overwhelmed by so many things, and we feel that we have no agency, there's no way that we can change things. But if we resign ourselves to the mess that we are in, it obviously will not go away. Life continues, tomorrow the sun continues to rise, and our kids will have to live under these uncomfortable circumstances. We have to appreciate the fact that those who do these things do so because they benefit from them. They are determined to continue, and they will not surrender without a fight. So we equally have to be determined to fight them off. If not for ourselves, but for the future, to rescue the future. Keep on fighting.
I don't really think that there's anything that I could possibly say that would improve on what has been said from our panelists and on the floor, except that this for me has been one of the most outstanding debates that we've had and one of the most constructive and valuable. So thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists and to Prof that come from a far way. They're busy people. I know that Sipho has actually drove into East London tonight, and he is driving out after the dialogue. So thank you very much, and thank you to our audience, and good night.